I'm going to be presenting, ZL and I are going to be presenting some joint work with Byron Ahn and also Donna Jo Napoli at Swarthmore College, who couldn't be here this weekend. And we're going to talk to you about a specific case of intonational prosodic variation that is not based on an intrinsic identity per se, but more about a situationally specific conversational role. And that's specifically the role of newscaster. So I think we all sort of have this intuition, right, that newscasters, they speak differently, right? They just sound different. And it's sort of hard to pin down exactly how. I think we can all kind of hum some tunes, right? But this really hasn't been measured, especially in terms of prosody and especially for American English. And the other thing is, I think we all have this idea. I know when I was sort of fresh out of college, I moved to New York City. I was living in this apartment with very thin walls. And I would come home after work, and my neighbors would have the news on, and I could hear it through the wall, and I couldn't hear a single word, but I could tell that it was the news. And again, I think this is an intuition that many of us share. So we had, approaching it from this point of view with these sorts of intuitions, we had a couple of questions. What does it mean to talk like a newscaster? So we have, okay, no click. No anything?
Google Slides.
There we go, okay. So we had a couple of questions that we're trying to answer here. So first of all, what does a newscaster sound like? What makes a newscaster sound like a newscaster in a measurable rather than just an impressionistic sort of way? So a couple of things we can look at are, first of all, speed and loudness. So we look at syllables per second, total duration of whatever the utterance is, and intensity range. We're looking at pitch, so in terms of maximum, minimum, and mean F0, and also distributions and variability across different sort of areas of the pitch range. We're looking at prosodic targets, so use of pitch accents particularly. And we're also looking at phrasing, so phrase breaks and boundary tones and things like that. So again, a lot has been looked at for newscaster speech in terms of lexical choices, in terms of syntactic structures, but very little in terms of prosody, and most of what's out there has been very impressionistic. And it has not yet been decoupled from that lexical content, which I think is a major confound when we're looking at what's going on, because of course the lexical choice is different. I mean, look at the sorts of things that they're talking about, not what we talk about generally in conversational speech. So second question, if we can see that newscasters speak differently, next question is why? What are they doing with this? What purposes is it serving in terms of communication? So some hypotheses here are, one, that they're trying to gain listeners' trust. They're trying to be this impartial, authoritative source of information. Trust me as I'm telling you about how the world is. So they may be looking for things like authority, impartiality, believability. Also keeping listeners' attention, because I can tell you all I want and you can trust me, but if you're not paying attention, if you're not listening, it kind of doesn't matter. So they can be, we think, going for things like charisma and likability, and also just ways to up listener investment in the presentation. And so ask about our follow-up survey of newscaster goals, which I'm going to sort of zoom through in this talk, but we have a lot more. And number three, so yes, they speak differently. Yes, they have reasons for doing this. Can listeners actually perceive this, right? Is that message getting across? So a couple things we looked at here are, first of all, can listeners distinguish newscaster speech solely based on prosody? So again, without any access to lexical or syntactic content. And second of all, if they can, how? What features are they actually paying attention to in order to do this? So we ran two experiments. And I'm going to tell you about the first one, and then CL is going to tell you about the second one. So our first experiment was looking at production. So major research question, how is newscaster speech measurably different from non-newscaster speech? And I should add that this is the first study we're aware of for American English that is actually looking at this. There was one previous study by Cotter, which was very, very small. We had quite a bit more data. So in terms of design, we had 12 target sentences that we were looking at. So these were all from WBUR, which is the NPR station in Boston. Some of you may listen to it. And this was very conveniently collected for us via the BU Radio News Corpus. So thank you very much, Stephanie, for that. Made all of this possible. So these are from actual news broadcasts, again, on WBUR in the early 1990s. So if you're worried about that date, feel free to ask us about it later in the question period. We had three conditions. So first, we took the original news broadcast as it actually showed up on the radio, and we pulled these 12 target sentences from these news broadcasts. Our second condition was what we're calling the nonfiction condition. So we brought in volunteers into the phonetics lab at Swarthmore, and we had them read these exact same scripts and then extracted these same target sentences from them. Now, we told these speakers, we didn't tell them where the scripts came from. It was very, very clear reading them. You know, even if they never say the word news, you know it's a news broadcast, right? And we had a bunch of people tell us, even though we told them, you know, read as conversationally and naturally as possible, they would come out of the sound booth and say to us, yeah, I found myself really slipping into this newscaster voice, and I really had to sort of fight against it. We're gonna come back to that idea later, but we were worried that this would just make them sound like newscasters, and we wouldn't find the actual differences that we think do exist. So luckily, one of our co-authors, Donna Jo Napoli, happens to be an award-winning children's book author. So she took these 12 sentences and embedded them in much more natural conversational contexts in order to, again, make it easier to speak conversationally and to sort of mask their origin in a news report. So this is our third, our fiction, what we're calling setup. So let me see if I can get some sound files to play, if I can just get my mouse back here. So let's start with the news example.
Randall Adams spent 12 years in prison before Texas finally overturned his conviction 2 years ago.
Let me play that one more time, the beginning cut off.
Randall Adams spent 12 years in prison before Texas finally overturned his conviction 2 years ago.
And then we have our nonfiction reader for this sentence.
Randall Adams spent 12 years in prison before Texas finally overturned his conviction 2 years ago.
And finally, our fictionalized version of this sentence.
Randall Adams spent 12 years in prison before Texas finally overturned his conviction 2 years ago.
Okay. So hopefully you can all hear the difference. And I mean, in this particular example, I think the newscaster sounds very distinctive. And you can hear that these are also matched for gender. So each sentence was read by volunteers of the same gender as the original newscaster who read that sentence. Moving on, yes. So in this talk, we're going to talk about news versus non-news. So we're going to conflate the results from those last two conditions. They did actually turn out somewhat differently, and you can ask Byron about that in the questions if you're curious. So we had 18 readers total. So 6 of these readers were the original newscasters. We know very little about them. In some cases we know their names, but that's often about it. Our other 12 were the volunteers we brought in. So those were post-college adults from the Philadelphia and Swarthmore area. So specifically, they were 11 faculty and staff from Swarthmore College and 1 recovering linguist from the Philadelphia area when we couldn't find any more Swarthmore volunteers. They were, again, balanced for gender, 9 and 9, and there were 9 white speakers, 2 black speakers, and 1 of South Asian heritage. And unfortunately, that's about all we know about these speakers. At the time, we were thinking of them as just stimuli and not as experimental subjects, which obviously is not quite right. And so each one read their entire script. We extracted all 12 target sentences, or all sort of 6 gender-appropriate target sentences, and then actually used 2 sentences from each speaker in the experiment. So some of our results. So first of all, differences in speed and loudness. So newscasters in our sample had a slower speech rate than non-newscasters, and this is actually contra to Cotter's earlier findings in her smaller study. And a smaller intensity range. So they were not going louder and softer as much as the non-newscasters. And notice we can only talk about range of intensity here. We can't talk about absolute intensity because, of course, we can't control for how far were they from the microphone, what were the recording conditions, what were the post-processing conditions. So we can only really talk about relative range here. Next, looking at pitch. So newscasters in our sample had a lower minimum F0. And that's not terribly surprising. We think of newscasters as having sort of a lower voice. And this held for both male and female speakers. In terms of maximum F0, only our female speakers had a lower maximum F0. And I want you to take this particular result with a bit of a grain of salt. We had one speaker who we're calling LA who was rather an outlier. If you see those two dots sort of right at the top of the distribution for the female non-news, those are both her, and she is visibly way above everyone else on every pitch measure. Two dots because two sentences, right? That said, there is no difference in the pitch range. So both news and non-news readers had the same range, or the same size of range, I should say. And newscasters, when we're talking about variability of pitch, they had a larger standard deviation in their F0 than the non-news readers. So this is one measure of variability that a lot of the previous literature on newscasters and related traits have looked at. So we looked at that, but we also thought this is not giving us the whole story. So we took people's entire pitch range, and for each speaker, we took that pitch range and we divided it into 4 equal quartiles. So the very top, the sort of next 25%, the next 25%, and then the lowest 25% of their pitch range. We took measurements at 10 millisecond intervals, and of all of those pitched points, we've looked at how many fell into which quartile of the pitch range. And some interesting stuff came out here. So we found that newscasters spent less time in their lowest quartile, which remember that floor is lower than the non-news speakers. They spent more time in the third quartile, so near the top, and they spent more time in the 4th quartile. And also, if we look at just this bottom 10%, they spent even less time in the bottom just 10% than in the bottom quartile. So when you bear in mind that the mean pitch is the same across these groups, there's no difference, this really indicates that newscasters are hitting these really short, very low targets. So they're going very low and then they're getting out really quickly in a way that non-news readers were not doing. So we have an example for you. So here's a pitch track, and you can say in the middle on the word language, there's that very low dip. And so let me play that quickly.
Brilsch hasn't learned sign language because everyone he knows can hear.
All right, play that again.
Brilsch hasn't learned sign language because everyone he knows can hear.
So this very typical newscaster intonation with that very low dip on the word language there. And in terms of pitch accents, so we have newscasters are using a larger number of L+H stars, which is interesting based on what Nicole was saying yesterday about this particular contour, I think. They're using fewer L star plus H. In fact, they're using none, whereas the non-newscasters used not a lot, but a couple. This shouldn't be surprising if this particular contour conveys uncertainty. That's exactly what you would expect newscasters not to do. So that makes a lot of sense. And they had overall an equal number of total pitch accents when you control for content, which is interesting because one of these impressionistic findings that comes up a lot in the literature is that newscasters are just putting stresses and prominences everywhere, willy-nilly. We don't find that at all. And in terms of phrase breaks, they use more intonation breaks, but there is no difference in intermediate phrases or boundary tones. So yes, we tested a lot of things. This is a hypothesis generating experiment, as is the next one. Each of these should probably be independently verified, but I think it's interesting to sort of see where can we go with this. So yes, newscasters really do speak differently, and this has been shown for other countries, other languages, but it's good to see it in American English. And they're characterized mostly by slow speed, brief extra low targets, and more large size breaks. Very quickly, why are they doing this? Well, some of these things that they're doing seem to be supporting authority, right? I know what I'm talking about, please believe me. Other things seem to be supporting listener attention and comprehension. I want you to pay attention to me, we're not in the same room, you could turn off the radio at any time, please listen and understand what I'm saying. And they have these conflicting goals. So we did survey some newscasters, and this is mirrored by what's in the literature already, that on the one hand, they're trying to be authoritative. On the other hand, they're trying to boost engagement. They're also trying to boost comprehensibility. And each of these traits has conflicting markers. So things that boost authority will sort of lower listener engagement and vice versa. So they're sort of trying to do a little of each. So it's a very mixed bag of what we see. Newscasters themselves really insisted on our survey, oh, I'm just speaking conversationally. I don't do anything different with my voice. Which on a certain level, like, yeah, no, we can measure this. On the other hand, well, yeah, they are speaking conversationally for this particular very specific conversation, right? And I think that's what's important here. And I also just want to note that a lot of the literature on things like what are the correlates of authority and charisma come not from linguists, but from the business and advertising fields. So a lot of that is a little problematic in terms of what they're measuring, how they're measuring it, etc. So I'm going to turn it over to CL.
So now that we know that newscasters in fact do things differently, we want to know how people can tell. So we ran a perception study. So this one, we used the same clips from the previous experiment, but they were low pass filtered so that you had no access to the segmental information. And we can listen to that here. So this is supposed to fully represent the experience of being in a New York apartment with very thin walls. We ran a forced choice and confidence rating task. So for every clip that a participant heard, they were forced to say if they thought it came from a newscaster or not and how confident they were in this. And each subject heard 18, so yes, half of the clips. We ran this on Amazon Mechanical Turk. We had 481 subjects, which generated over 9,000 observation points. The age range was quite large. We had a very diverse set of people in terms of age, but the gender distribution was fairly equal. And the vast majority of them were Native American English speakers, and actually the great majority of them were monolingual. All of the people in the study were from US IP addresses, so we believe that they were from the US. So we ran a logistic regression model on the data and found one that has an R-square of 0.94, which is really incredible. So we can explain 94% of the variation in the data with the stuff that we looked at. And it turns out, yeah, people can tell the difference, right? But they can't do it very well. So the average accuracy was only 57%, and the standard deviation of that accuracy was 11%. So while people did perform above chance, some people did much worse. And if you're wondering about signal detection measures, so the recall was like 67%, their precision was only 42%. And so overall their F1 score is actually only 0.51, which is not excellent. Some of these results are summarized here in these graphs. So you see that the newscaster clips were rated more likely to be from newscasters than not, but the non-newscaster clips were kind of a toss-up actually. And it turns out that only for the newscaster clips did confidence interval have any, or confidence rating have anything to do with how newscaster-like they seemed. So the results. We found that based on this model, listeners are listening to the lower minimum F0 for both male and female targets. And they were also listening to the time newscasters spent in the middle 50% of the range. This is symptomatic of the extra low targets that we were talking about earlier. So that's pretty good. We also found that there are actually quite a few factors that they ignore. So for instance, they do not pay attention to the decreased speed of newscasters. They do not pay attention to the fact that newscasters have more big IPs. They do not pay attention to the more L+H stars. And actually, very intriguingly, they pay attention to some measures which are not actually different. So they believe that newscasters were, they believe that a clip was more likely to be from a newscaster if it was longer in terms of seconds. This is not true. They also believe that newscasters were more likely to, the clips were more likely to be from a newscaster based on the time that the speaker spent in the first quartile, which is not true. Recall that newscasters spent less time in the first quartile. And they also were listening to the number of H-star pitch accents, even though that was not different. So what can we say about this? Well, so listeners can tell the difference between newscaster prosody and non-newscaster prosody, and we think that this is because of the conversational goals that newscasters have. In fact, this is consistent with a study from 2017 where newscaster features were added to non-newscaster clips of Iberian Spanish, and the modified clips were found to be more likely to be categorized as coming from newscaster. So that's good. But they're really terrible at it. Their accuracy is low. Yeah, I'm just going to go quickly because I've actually run out of time. There's a clear mismatch here between what newscasters do and our models of it. And some takeaways. So there are competing demands between newscasters, conversational goals, and what we mean is that newscasters have a voice here, but that's because they share a common communicative scenario. And to just slightly restate what I just said, it's likely that the shared conversational goals are what drive these differences. Newscaster speech differs from non-newscaster speech, not necessarily how we would expect based on the literature or anecdotal impressions, but we can tell that there is a difference and that these differences are actually subphonemic and intonationally subphonemic, which is kind of a cool finding. So here's a summary of our takeaways, and thank you very much for listening.
We have a few minutes for questions. Please introduce yourself, and we will solicit questions from students first.
Jeff Valentine from Michigan. I was curious actually to hear more about the embedded fiction versus those non-fictional clippings and what the differences were, because that's kind of amazing.
So yeah, here's an excerpt of our unmodified script. It's very newsy, so you know the target sentences are highlighted here. So these are two from the story, and it's sort of exactly what you would expect from NPR. If you go to the next slide, this is those same sentences in our fictionalized script, and it has, you know, again, it's not maybe something you would actually say in conversation, but I think it's much more colloquial. It's much less newsy. There's, you know, plenty of very colloquial sorts of things in there. Yeah.
There's also a lot of, like she's saying, there's more, there's like contractions in this version, for example. And there's also, Donna Jo did a careful job of making sure some of the same conversational points were embedded in the story. So like, you know, saying like this builds to this, builds to this. So it's not like the narrative was very different overall. So it's just really the lexical syntactic type choices that seem to be primarily different, we hope.
And what kind of like pronunciation differences? Like,
Oh.
how were the, or if you,
So
how were the intonations?
that was, you mean like segmentally?
No, the prosody.
Oh, we're starting those measures now. So I can tell you just one quick thing about that, which is that here. Oh no, where is it? I have a thing. No, I don't have a thing.
I don't think we put it in here.
I have it on my version. Anyway, so I have a version that I can show you later that has a graph of showing the difference between the newscasters and the two different types of non-newscasters and how they're rated as newscasters or not, and there's some surprising results.
Yeah, Ivy Hauser, UMass. I'm wondering about the production results and what the ratio of between speaker to within speaker variation was in the newscaster and non-newscaster categories. So I'm asking because I was particularly puzzled by this result where like the range of F0 values was higher for the non-newscasters, but the standard deviation was higher for the newscasters. And I'm wondering if that increased range could just be due to like the fact that you had more speakers in the non-newscaster condition.
Oh, I see.
So we had, let me see. So there's no difference in the size of their range. It was only in the standard deviation.
So the
Standard
absolute
deviation
in terms of the size is measured in terms of absolute pitch. So absolute pitch max in hertz minus absolute pitch min in hertz, and so that was just a range of hertz, and that was the same. So for within men and within women, they're identical across the newscaster non-newscaster divide. But the standard deviation is not measured in was this measured in hertz? It was measured in hertz. Yeah.
Yeah, but how many speakers were there in each condition?
So there were 6 speakers in each condition, 3 male, 3 female.
And there were 6 newscasters as well.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Maybe 2 more questions from anyone?
Oh. I saw it.
So Edward Fleming, MIT. I'm wondering whether your newscasters aren't entirely wrong when they say that they're speaking naturally. Because one thing that struck
yes.
me is something that's very familiar from trying to elicit intonation this way. The non-newscasters sound like they're reading.
Sure.
So it's not like conversational speech versus newscaster speech. It's non-professional readers versus newscaster readers.
Yeah, so, I mean,
This was actually, so the preliminary finding from our 2 non-newscaster speeches is that in fact the conversational speech, the modified fiction version, was more newscaster-like in some ways than when they read off the newscaster script. And we think the reason for this really is that the conversational goals are very natural for this sort of like information giving sort of thing. But when people were reading the original script, they were thinking like, oh, this is like news. I should sound like news. But that's not actually what news sounds like, right? Those speakers actually have different conversational goals than newscasters have.
Which is related to the fact that the ratings for the unmodified versions were in fact rated as less newscastery than the. I also wanted to address your reading, the general point of reading versus non-reading. So everyone here is doing reading. So we specifically chose from the NPR corpus anything that was only one speaker without another speaker in the same recording, and reading the news, so as opposed to sort of delivering an on-site report or a news magazine kind of show.
No, sure. What I meant was by saying that maybe they're not wrong. They're just speaking naturally. Is what they're trying to do is learn to read in a way that sounds more.
Sure.
yeah, they're speaking naturally for this very specific situation, but it is, yeah, given that situation, absolutely natural. So yeah, in that sense, they are absolutely right.
One more brief question. You pick.
Yeah, I was wondering if you thought about variation between different types of news. And what I mean by this is like, so I'm in Alabama and sometimes I travel and like NPR to me has a very different sound than like conservative talk radio or Fox News. You know, it's like to me, just my layperson's impression is NPR sounds much more formal, whereas the conservative stuff sounds much more informal. So I was just wondering if you thought about that, or if you thought about looking at that.
Yeah, and I think going forward, we really hope to run those experiments with newscasters, get some CNN anchors, get some Fox anchors, get Sean Hannity, right, get all this range. And it's just not in this study, but yeah, we would expect it to be very different.
Although I should point out here that we actually did have a wide range of topics that these newscasters were talking about. So some of them were talking about like sports, some of them about like scientific results or political events. So there actually was a range of things that these NPR speakers were talking about.
And one last note is that the NPR the NPR newscasters themselves seem to be aware that they have an NPR voice. So if you listen to NPR podcasts, there are radio commercials sometimes. They're like, if you want an experience as smooth as an NPR newscaster's voice, they say like this in the ad. So they know what they sound like, and they know that they have a very particular type of sound.